Now, in 2002, Keith Windschuttle published the first book in a series called The Fabrication of Aboriginal History. It looked at the dispossession of Aborigines in Tasmania and claimed other historians had exaggerated the extent of violence involved.
Keith Windschuttle has now published another book in his series which considers the so-called stolen generations and concludes that they're a myth. The term became widely known in 1997 when the Australian Human Rights Commission published a report, Bringing Them Home. It claimed that for much of the 20th century, between 10 and 30% of Aboriginal children were taken from their parents forcibly and on no grounds except that of race. One of the report's authors suggested that 100,000 children were involved. The report described this collective action as genocide.
In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologised to the stolen generations and was widely praised for doing so. I spoke with Keith Windschuttle earlier today. I asked him where the term stolen generations originally came from.
Well, it was actually Peter Reid's wife. Peter Reid, who was then a postgraduate student at ANU, wrote a pamphlet about removals in New South Wales and called it the Lost Generations. And his wife thought that that was a bit soft, and why don't you call it Stolen Generations? His wife is not Aboriginal, and nor is Peter. So it's a term, a white term, conjured up out of thin air.
And when did he write that paper?
Well, he wrote that in 1981. And that was it got some notice in social policy circles. I read it then, and in legal circles. But Aborigines didn't really pick it up until 2 or 3 years later.
But they surely would have been aware of the phenomenon, wouldn't they, before he wrote his pamphlet?
Well, Reid himself has given a description of when Coral Edwards, his co-author in Link Up, the social work organisation, announced the discovery of this policy to a meeting of an Aboriginal advisory group in Canberra, and they had never heard of it themselves. They were middle-aged Aboriginal activists, people who'd been around for a long time and became government advisors. They'd never heard of it, but suddenly they realised that this was supposedly the explanation for all their problems. Instead of their own families having giving good reason for children to be removed, it was all a plot by the government, and this was a far more comfortable explanation than what they'd believed before.
In his apology, Kevin Rudd spoke of up to 50,000 children being removed, and an American friend of mine who heard this ventured the opinion that this must be a legal goldmine. He asked me how much litigation there'd been as people sought compensation from the government. How many members of the Stolen Generations have successfully sued the government for compensation?
Well, there's only been one successful court case, and that's Bruce Trevorrow in South Australia, who it was actually removed illegally because South Australia didn't have any laws that allowed the organisation that removed him to do so. And he had a pretty bad life, and I think he kind of deserved the verdict he got. Bruce Trevorrow is the only one, and the fact that human rights lawyers have been lining up for 25 years looking for cases to take to courts, and the fact that people have written memoirs, autobiographies about the subject, and yet none of those who've ever gone to court have been successful, I think is pretty telling. It's in itself, it's good evidence that the argument that these historians have put can't be sustained in any court of law.
Is there any legal obstacle to seeking compensation?
Not as far as I know. The Supreme Court in South Australia awarded Trevorrow $500,000. There's been a couple of cases where people have gone to administrative tribunals and they've got $5,000-6,000. I think there's 2 or 3 of those. But if there were 50,000 people, the lack of success in the courts just doesn't gel with the story that they've been telling.
We have heard these estimates of the size of the stolen generations from 50, indeed sometimes going up to 100,000. How many Aboriginal or part Aboriginal children do you think were forcibly removed?
Well, I've gone through all the records, the existing records, which are pretty comprehensive. Actually, most of the state archives will give you their annual reports which contain the data of children removed each year. I've put a tally of 8,200 people nationwide between 1910 and 1970, which are the years that the Human Rights Commission reckoned there was genocide being committed in Australia against the Aborigines on this issue, and their children removed for good reasons and bad. Some of them went to hospital for sustained periods, not just overnight, but for sustained periods. Some of them went to jail. Some of them went to child welfare institutions. But there were very few child welfare institutions in Australia. That's another thing that no one's ever investigated. How many institutions were there? In New South Wales, there were 3 operating at any one time. In Northern Territory, there's supposed to have been two, but when you actually look at what they did, they were hostels for kids who were going to school. They weren't. They had a small number of welfare clients who eventually became kind of cause celebs, but their basic function of those institutions was not to take stolen children that their parents voluntarily sent there. Aboriginal people working in remote stations, on pastoral stations in Central Australia, were very pleased when opportunities were given to their children to live in town, go to school in town, come home for the holidays. And when you read the records of those institutions, you find the kids did go home for the holidays.
Keith, this takes us to the issue that was raised after your first book, which is the, in some cases, conflict between oral history and documentary history. How convinced are you that the documentary history in this case does represent the situation accurately?
Well, look, I don't really have a big problem with the oral history that people who say they're stolen children have told. I don't have a big problem with the interviews in the Bringing Them Home report by the Human Rights Commission, because most of those are about the childhood memories of people, how they were taken, what a trauma it was. But the critical issue about the stolen generations is not what it felt like to be removed from your parents. The critical issue is what were the policies of the governments, and that's what I've spent most of my research looking for. And the policies of the government were not to eliminate Aboriginality, were not to destroy Aboriginal culture, were not to do anything that was any different to what was done to white children from disadvantaged, dysfunctional families in very similar situations.
Well, we've been told that the reason, or one of the reasons for removing Aboriginal or part Aboriginal people from their parents, was this notion of breeding out the colour. Were those two notions, the removal and the breeding out the colour, ever linked?
Well, they've been linked recently in the stories people have told about the stolen generations. Historians and the Bring Them Home report have made that connection. But when you actually go back and look at the people who are advocating breeding out the colour, they didn't advocate the removal of children as part of it. It's quite a separate issue. And Cecil Cook, the Aboriginal protector in Northern Territory in the 1930s, he was very strongly in favour of the idea of breeding out the colour. It was entirely a matter of arranging marriages of half-caste Aboriginal women to white men. In my view, and I say in my book, it was a sort of harebrained scheme that never had any chance of coming off. You can't force people to marry anyone if they don't want to, but historians have told us that this was government policy and was approved by governments. The only two people in Australia were Cook and A.O. Neville in Western Australia, who were protectors who supported this idea. Their own governments, the Commonwealth government, which made the laws for the Northern Territory, and the Western Australian government, which did the same in its own state, did not support their chief protectors on this issue. They never gave them either the money, the premises, or the legal ability to put this thing into operation. And in fact, the Commonwealth government under Joseph Lyons was, quite frankly, embarrassed and somewhat aghast at the proposal, and had nothing and rejected it when Cook eventually put it up. But all this discussion, and there's hundreds of pages of government records you can read about this in the archives, is about arranging marriages. It's not about a policy to remove children. Breeding out the colour and the stolen generations are two separate issues.
One major source for popular concern about the stolen generations is Sally Morgan's 1987 book My Place, which was a phenomenal success. It sold over 600,000 copies and it's widely used in schools. Morgan says her Aboriginal ancestors were forcibly removed from the outback to Perth. Was that true?
She had one grandmother who she said was forcibly removed, but she wasn't removed for very long because she went to Perth as a nanny. As a 15-year-old girl, she was employed as a nanny for the Drake Brockman family. She stayed with them for a few months while the wife, Alice Drake Brockman, had another baby. But every year for the next 5 years, certainly throughout the early 1920s, she returned with the family to Corona Downs, where her mother lived. She must have seen her mother again every time she went there. The family spent half the year in Corona Downs, or more than half the year in Corona Downs, and the children she looked after did correspondence school from there. They went back to Perth for the hot season over the Christmas holiday period, and then they came back again.
Was there any force involved,
Look, there's two accounts. There's Sally Morgan's account, which is from the memories of people 60 years later. There's Judith Drake Brockman's account, which is published in a book called Wongi Wongi, which she published in the early 2000s. And what I've simply done is I've given Judith Drake Brockman the opportunity in my own book through hers to give her side of things. And probably the most telling thing I've got in the book is a photograph of Sally's mother back at Corona Downs with the children. The babies and the baby in the photograph is still a baby, so it must be a matter of only months after she went to Perth to be nanny for the children. So forcible removal doesn't fit at all.
Another major source for the stolen generations, perhaps the main one, is the Bringing Them Home report. Now, Robert Mann has written that the report heard directly from 535 Aborigines. Is it been suggested, he said, that the overall picture that the witnesses painted might represent a kind of collective hallucination? Now, that sounds to me like a good question. It's one that occurred to me at the time I first read the report. How would you answer that? How would you describe the fact that those 500 people said what they did say?
I believe most of them. I don't doubt that most of them are telling the truth. There's a couple who are not. There's one woman who says that her mother told her that some girl was beaten to death at Cootamundra, and that could not possibly have happened for reasons I go into in the book. But apart from that, being removed from your family, whatever race you're from, is obviously a terribly traumatic event. All the children, the 500 children who describe what happened to them, are talking about the process of removal and how they were institutionalised, and some of them were just sent straight to work. I don't have any great problem about believing that at all. But that's not the critical issue. The issue in the stolen generations is why the authorities acted as they did. It's quite consistent with traumatic removal of black children to be removed for exactly the same welfare reasons as for white children. And I go through which is something that the historians of the stolen generations have never done, I go through the history of white child welfare policies at the same time, and you find that the policies for white children and black children are the same. But the intentions of the authorities to remove children as young as possible, to remove them permanently, and to remove them so they would not grow up in contact with Aboriginal culture, that's a matter of the policies of the bureaucracies and the politicians who administered the series over a period of 60, 70 years. And if you just think about it, you haven't got to look at the research. There's supposedly a colossal conspiracy by hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of welfare workers, politicians, to keep this what they were doing secret from the Australian public, from the parliaments, from Aboriginal people certainly, and no one picked it up until the 1980s, when a postgraduate student looking for a topic that would get him a thesis passed suddenly discovered the truth that had eluded everybody else, including all the left-wing Aboriginal groups who were around in the 60s, early 70s, many of them very astute people, very astute political. The people who set up the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. Symbolically, that was absolutely deft, creative piece of political symbolism. And yet they couldn't see, according to Peter Reid, they couldn't see the genocide that was going on right beneath their eyes. So the story just doesn't make sense in itself.
There may have been many individual stories, but no one had ever pulled it together from around Australia in that way. So are you sort of agreeing that many of those 500 people that the Bringing Them Home report looked at were forcibly removed?
Oh yeah, there's plenty of forcible removals. Children who are removed from drunken, alcoholic, abusive parents are usually removed under forcible situations, whatever the colour of the family. There's good accounts of white children in a suburban Sydney and Melbourne where the same thing happens. Forcible removals happen in child welfare all the time. We see them in the paper today. That's it's not the question of whether there were forcible removals. It's the intentions of the authorities. And I go through all the documents about the intentions of the authorities, and you don't find anywhere a statement, we want to get rid of Aboriginality, we want to suppress Aboriginal culture. that is just absent from the record. And it's absent from the record where some of the historians say, they give footnotes, they cite certain reports, and you look at those reports and there's no mention of getting rid of Aboriginal culture at all. They are talking about traditional welfare reasons. Children are malnourished, they're subject to violence.
But one of the most moving aspects of the Bringing Them Home report stories is the sometimes horrific conditions in institutions that are described. Do you agree that those institutions were sometimes terrible in the way that they're depicted there?
I think some of the institutions were terrible. Moore River, which is filmed in the Rabbit-Proof Fence film, it was a dump, and people at the time, Paul Hasluck said, this place is a dump, it should go. There was a Royal Commission into its administration. I mean, A.O. Neville, the Chief Protector in Western Australia, should have been sacked just because of the conditions that were allowed to prevail at Moore River. And he didn't need money. Like, the place was ridden with bed bugs and fleas and lice, and that doesn't cost much to get rid of, but he never lifted a finger to do it. On the other hand, in New South Wales, I've got a long argument in my book about the conditions at Cootamundra Hospital, the Cootamundra Girls' Hill, which was formerly a white hospital, and at Kinchela Aboriginal Boys' Home, a place I visited a couple of decades ago. And the conditions there were better than you get in... at the time, in white outer suburban or rural country towns. Aboriginal kids... One of the things that Peter Reid is trying to demonise the Kinchela Boys' Home, he says, it was shocking. There was no swimming pools and there was no gymnasiums for the boys. Well, at the time, most of the boys... I mean, I was growing up at the time he's talking about, and we didn't have a swimming pool in our whole municipality, let alone at the school. But in fact, in 1948, the boys at Kinchela got a swimming pool and they got a gymnasium at a time of post-war austerity when it's very hard to get any building done at all. And there's a photograph in the 1950 annual report of the Aborigines Protection Board of the boys in the pool. It's an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It's not just some little tub. It's not plastic walls. It's a proper Olympic swimming pool. And the caption to the picture is these boys could become Olympic champions. They had terrific facilities. They had motion pictures. They had movies every Saturday night at the home.
You've described the notion of the stolen generations as a myth. If it is a myth, what do you think has been its effect on contemporary policy and thinking regarding Aborigines?
Well, I think obviously it's deepened the sense that Aborigines are victims of Australian society and Australian history. And the cult of victimhood, which I think the more intelligent people in Aboriginal affairs know, is just has been a disaster for a long time. It doesn't help Aboriginal people get out of anything. The perpetual grievance that Aboriginal people feel about their treatment in Australia, it's something that Aboriginal politicians can play off. Support me because white people are dreadful and awful, and they try to commit genocide on you. I mean, the charge of genocide, people sort of talk about it and don't kind of treat it seriously. But the idea that, which academic historians do, that Australia wanted to commit genocide against the Aborigines in the same way that the Nazis did against the Jews, it just doesn't fit what we know about this country.
Keith Windschuttle, whose new book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, Volume 3, is published by Macleay Press. Now, in the book, Robert Mann, Professor of Politics at La Trobe University, is criticised for, according to the book, incorrectly linking child removals to a desire to breed out the colour of Aboriginal people. Windschuttle has called for an investigation of this by the university. Robert Mann responds to Windschuttle on Tuesday night this week on Late Night Live.
What will be making the news in 2010? With a federal election due and a new leader of the opposition, see all the latest Monday to Friday nights on Lateline, celebrating 20 years. And you can't afford to miss Lateline Business, featuring industry and finance news, interviews with the key players, and analysis of the issues driving the world of business. Monday to Thursday nights. ABC News' Lateline, followed by Lateline Business. Catch them on ABC One.
Well, that's it for us this week. Counterpoint, where the good things just keep on coming, is produced by Ian Coombe. Our sound engineer is John Magic Fingers Diamond. I'm Paul Comrie Thompson.
And I'm Michael Duffy, and coming up before too long, the ABC Radio National News.
Dr. Carmen, aren't you a renowned anti-GM scientist?
No. As soon as you start raising issues about, well, maybe it may not be safe to eat, maybe you'd better do some more research because, look, here are all the problems with the current safety testings on GM, you get labelled immediately as a radical, greeny, Luddite, anti-GM activist. So all you have to do is raise concerns and you start getting vilified.
You can stream or download this discussion on Bush Telegraph from the ABC Radio National website.